Beloved friends, in case any of you didn't hear what our dear chairman was saying, Dennis said, I'm going to ask him to repeat it. I want to say at the outset that I believe this is an afternoon, that is up until this point, that we will never forget. After this, we'll skip a little bit, and then when Doug Martin comes in, of course, that will be another time that we will never forget. But I feel for us to be in the presence of two of these precious Afnans is something very special. Very special indeed. It makes me think that I could be in that beautiful library of Hassan Bayuzi, sitting in one of those two chairs with those thousands of books that Dr. Abbas told us about, sipping tea from those beautiful cups, and just being in the presence of our dear friend Hassan Bayuzi. He was a very special person. We can talk for a long time without being able, at least I couldn't, grasp the kind of person he was. But I feel closer to it now when I am with Dr. Abbas and Dr. Muhammad Afnan, because they have the same spirit, the same feeling, the same gentle, loving tenderness that we always had when we were with Hassan Bayuzi. He was a sweet, gentle, beautiful person. He was a true Afnan. And you know, we come across the word Afnan in the prayer book now and again, without having a real feel for what that means. I think now we will know. I think we've had a beautiful taste of it today. I remember one time at one of our meetings at Baji, asking Hassan just how he got to be an Afnan. And he said, well, I was so, I was related to this one and that one. Well, I said, I'd just love to have a record of that. Would you mind writing it out? So Hassan, being Hassan, always willing to do anything to help anybody, he started in to write. And he had a pad. Now, Dr. Afnan has given us his family tree, but Hassan wrote out for me 3 or 4 times as much as this. And just what it was he wrote, I don't know. I didn't intend that he should go to such trouble. But he was the kind of person who just would, and he did. Now, the only tragedy about it all is that I don't know where my copy of that tree is that he wrote out. I suspect that my wife pinched it. Whenever I'm looking at a course or a talk or something, I look around desperately for my books, and I find that Audrey has quietly put them away someplace. But at any rate, friends, you are now in the presence, and you have had these delightful talks from these two Afnans. And I personally just feel that I'm in the presence of Hassan again. And he was one we all loved. I remember every morning when we were in our conclaves at Baji, and the first year there were 26 of us, and then year after year it got down a little bit to 22. But we would meet every morning in the shrine of Baha'u'llah, and we would pray. And Rahia Hanum would always point one of us out as we went in, and she would say, now, John or Harry or so-and-so, you read the tablet of visitation of Baha'u'llah today. And that was a thing we all liked to be chosen to do. And she was able to make sure we all got the job at least once during that conclave or the next one. And there was that beautiful feeling of that tablet of visitation of Baha'u'llah, and then prostrating ourselves on the ground, on the floor, and then that powerful, powerful prayer, and the presence of us all being there. And then we would go to our conference chamber in the mansion of Baha'u'llah, and we would work all day, and in the evening, perhaps 6 o'clock or so, we would all go into the bedroom of Baha'u'llah. And that was a room that the beloved guardian didn't want it changed. It was the only room that didn't have any electricity in it. Shoghi Effendi wanted that room to stay just as it was when Baha'u'llah was there. And so we would go in there, and Baha'u'llah's bed was a big mattress on the floor, about center over to the wall, close to it, and beside it there was a little wooden table, and on top of it was a coal oil lamp. And Rahia would always be the first to go in, and she would light a match and light that lamp. And then the rest of us would come in. And then we would end the day with perhaps a half an hour or longer of prayer. And those were very special times. And I remember the feeling when Hassan Bayuzi prayed. He was different from anybody else. He was quite different. There was a quality about him. And now when we read his books and see what his life ended up in doing, in writing his books, which will last forever. He'll always have those beautiful books that he worked on for the last several years. And so I'm just reminiscing a little bit. And this is brought about by my feeling of absolute joy at having Dr. Muhammad and Dr. Abbas Afnan with us. And I just want to tell them that they were very glad to have it. They came. And we hope that they will come again another day. Do you agree with that? Well, now I am going to speak about Hassan Bayuzi in relation to another institution in which he played a very important part. And I'm going to tell you about it. But before I do, I feel that in this room there must be a number of Baha'is who have only been Baha'is in the last few years, the last, say, several years. And so in order to not be talking about something you perhaps don't know anything about, I'm going to go back and give you a little history. of the past, many years, just touching a little bit on this one subject in which Hassan Baluzi was very much involved and did wonderful work. I'm going to go back to the year 1921. Don't think there are many of you who were in the faith at that time here. But that was the year when our beloved master Abdu'l-Baha died, and Shoghi Effendi, his grandson, became the guardian. And from that year, 1921, until November 1957, Shoghi Effendi was our guardian. And he was under the infallible guidance of God. And I want to talk a little bit about this infallibility, because I think that there may be many of you who don't really understand what that is either. And in fact, I wonder if many of us here do understand what infallibility is. And just in case you don't, I want to mention just a little bit about that and say that back in the time of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, and then Shoghi Effendi, they were under the infallible guidance of God in their decisions, in the things they did, in the things they wrote. They were guided by God in everything they did having to do with the faith. Now, you may not understand that, so I will give you one or two examples. A favorite one of mine is the fact that one year Shoghi Effendi was very anxious to build a temple on the River Nile. And so he wrote to the National Spiritual Assembly of Northeast Africa and asked that assembly to find a property upon which we could build a temple. So they went, and he said he wanted it within so many miles of Cairo and on either side of the river. And they did this. They went up and down and up and down, and they couldn't find a single spot. And so they wrote to the guardian and said they were disappointed. They were heartbroken because they couldn't find a place and they had to disappoint him. And so Shoghi Effendi cabled back, persist, love, Shoghi. So they started over again. They went up and down the river and they had a real estate agent and they couldn't find any place. And finally they cabled again and they said they were heartbroken. But there was no place, absolutely not a spot. So Shoghi Effendi came back. And what do you think he said this time? He said, persist, love, Shoghi. So they started all over again. I think they appointed a new committee. And they got a new real estate agent. And I think they even got a canoe. But they went up and down that river. And finally, this new agent said, well, you know, there just isn't any place at all that we could give you. But there is a place that does answer the requirements. It's just that wide and that deep and so on. It has one drawback. And because of that drawback, I wouldn't sell it to you and you wouldn't buy it. So these fellows said, well, what's the drawback? Well, he said, this property is way underwater. And so they looked at the map, and then they looked out at the spot, and there was nothing but deep, deep water there. And they said, well, it answers the requirements to some extent. We'll send this to the guardian, and, let him decide. So they did. And to their surprise, they got a cable back, buy it. Love Shoghi. So they bought it. And there were some years, I knew it was there, but I didn't tell anybody. I didn't even tell my wife. Now, this indicates a little lack of faith on my part. But nevertheless, there you were. We had this beautiful spot, but way, way down. Feet. So, it just happened the very next year, General Nasser, who was then the premier, the prime minister of Egypt, he decided he wanted to have a scenic highway built right down the River Nile. And so they got all the road building equipment and everything, and they started plowing and digging, and before you knew it, that property line was built way up. And it made a beautiful spot for a temple. And we hardly paid anything for it. Now, friends, I could tell you more about that, but that generally is what infallibility is. I remember on the National Assembly in Canada, one thing the Guardian gave us in our first 7-year plan, our first 5-year plan, that we had to have some Baha'i on Greenland. And there was no way of getting onto Greenland, no way at all. And we inquired, and we were told that Greenland was the property of Denmark. Thank you. And it is a closed country. You couldn't get in, and if you were in, you couldn't get out. It was closed, absolutely closed. Nobody was allowed in. And we inquired about this. And we had done quite a lot of inquiring. And finally, one time we had a letter from the beloved Guardian saying, you're doing great, you're fine on the assembly work and in the pioneer work and so on, but you seem to be making no progress at all on Greenland. And so we wrote him and said, well, dear Shoghi Effendi, there is no chance of doing anything on Greenland. They won't let us in, and those who are in, they can't get out, and there's nothing we can do. And then the Guardian wrote us and he said, all you have to do is take the first step and know that God will help you with the other steps. Well, you know, that still applies. Just take the first step in anything, any of our teaching work or goal work or anything else, and God will do the rest of it. So, we went back to Shoghi Effendi and said, dear Shoghi Effendi, we find it hard to believe, but we're going to go do what you say. And so we wrote a letter to a girl in Copenhagen. Oh, I can't remember her name. Do you remember her? And she was a pioneer from America, the United States, and she'd been there about 6 months. And she'd gone over there to work on the 10 gold countries of Europe. And we wrote to her and asked her if she could help us to get into Greenland. And she wrote back and said, thank you for the compliment, but I can do nothing. She said, I've been here for 6 months, and really I wonder why I came. I don't know anybody. I don't speak the language. There's nothing I can do. And I ask you, please, pray for me. So we took this up to the NSA, and we really went to work to pray for her. And the very funny thing was that soon after that, we had a letter from her saying that a strange thing had happened. She went out of her apartment one afternoon, and she met a woman who appeared to be ill. And she went to her and found that this woman really needed something. And she asked her if she could help her. And she said, well, if you just give me a cup of tea. So she took her into her apartment and gave her a cup of tea, got to know her, and got to like her, and talked to her. Well, you'll never guess who that woman turned out to be. She turned out to be the sister of the wife of the governor of Greenland. Well, I happened to be going over to Europe the next year, and I wrote to her. Her name was Elstephine Wilson, and she was quite a gal, and a fine Baha'i. She became a Baha'i, and a very devoted one. And she knew everybody in the government because of her sister in Copenhagen. So she had it all arranged for me. I had the red carpet treatment. I met 3 very nice men in the Greenlandic department, and they told me, they said, you know, Mr. Robarts, we'd just love to get you in, we get some Baha'i in to Greenland, but it's absolutely impossible. Well, there's no way we can do it. It just cannot be done. We're sorry, but it can't be done. Well, I didn't say anything, but I felt like saying, well, my dear friend, you don't know Shoghi Effendi. But I knew Shoghi Effendi, and I knew something about infallibility. When he wanted something, he knew it was there. And all we had to do was to take the first step. Well, we had a meeting that night, and Baha'is came from many different countries around there, and there were 45 or so, and I told them the story of how we met Elstephine Boyanson, and how we were so anxious to get into Greenland. And there was one young lad there, he said, I can get in. And to make a long story short, he got in, and our goal was complete. And all we had to do was take one step, and so on it went. Well, now that is infallibility. I wish I had time to tell you some more, because there are some beautiful stories on this subject. But at least you know what that is, because I'm going now into the second part of this talk of mine, where infallibility comes into it. The guardian, before he died, just before he died, he wrote a letter to the Baha'is of the world. It was his last final letter, written within a month of his death. And this was to the Baha'is of the world. And in it, he called for many things, but he called for us to have 5 conferences, 5 transcontinental conferences, one in Kampala and Chicago and different places, ending up in Jakarta. But there were 5 of these around the world. And then it was in that last message that he named his final contingent of Hands of the Cause. And in that contingent, Hassan Bayuzi was one. And he mentioned the fact that he was in Afnan. And so we were all very happy about that. But then we know, sir, I happened to be in that final contingent of 8 too. And Bill Sears was in it, and people, you know them all, I hope. The next thing we did, the guardian died. That letter was in October. He died November the 4th. And we went to London to his funeral. And after that, and by this time there were 27 hands in the world. And at the funeral there were 26. There was one person, Corinne True of Wilmette, was not able to go. She was almost 100 years of age. So she didn't get there. But 26 of us went on to Haifa, and from Haifa on to Baji, and here's where we had our first conclave. And we had that, which lasted for 3 weeks, and then we had them every year, generally in October, lasting for perhaps 2 weeks, or sometimes closer to do. And what he meant by this chief stewards of the embryonic world commonwealth of Baha'u'llah, we didn't know. So there we were, seated around this big rectangular table, the 26 of us, and the first thing we realized was that that some of us spoke English and some of us spoke Persian, and most of the Persians couldn't speak English, and I think none of the English could speak Persian. So we were stuck. And it was then we learned, to our joy, that Hassan Bayuzi was fluent in both languages, and so was Abu Faizi. Faizi and Bayuzi. They were the only two who really could carry through this terrible job of translating for all of us. Now here's where I come to a little place that I'm not too sure about, but I'll tell you what it's all about. And that is that as we sat around this table, and we would sit all day long for 3 weeks. You know, sometimes I meet friends of mine who complain when they have to meet for 2 or 3 days in an assembly meeting, or perhaps a whole evening, and they find that terribly strenuous. But just let them have to meet for 3 weeks with 26 people, all, speaking different languages. It's quite something. And then it was November, and it was very cold in that room too. We nearly freeze when it got on towards the latter part of the afternoon. So, but usually he would get up and he would listen, and then after a time he would translate it all back to us in the other language. And then he would do that perhaps for an hour. And then Faizi would take his turn, and he would stand up. And I can see them now, one after the other, just standing there, folded arms, taking it all in and giving it all back. Now, I want to tell you that I have told this story a number of times. And here's the wisdom in our chairman saying that he didn't want any taping done because some people can make mistakes when they're giving a talk like this. Because I know that in telling this story, I have said that Bayuzi would stand there for as long as 20 minutes. And he would take it all in. And then he would give it all back in the other language. And he would do this again and again and again. 20-minute intervals. And I have said that I went to one of the hands who spoke both languages and said, look, how much are we getting in all this? And he said, you're getting every word. There's nothing missed. These men know how to translate. Now, I had a feeling just 3 weeks ago, knowing I was coming to give this talk here today, I phoned an old friend of mine and an old friend of yours, Bill Sears. I said, Bill, you know that business when Faizi and Bayuzi would stand up and translate for about 20 minutes? He said, 20 minutes? And I said, yes. I said, well, oh, no, it's 5 minutes. I said, oh, no, Bill, you just don't remember very well. Well, he said, John, you're crazy. Nobody can do that for 20 minutes. Well, I said, they have to, because I've been telling people that for several years. And this presents a certain difficulty with me, because Audrey so often accuses me of embroidering my story. Well, I never embroider a story. Now, I'm just going to let you decide whether it was 5 minutes or 20. And I think the person who's got to correct these tapes has got a job. And how he's going to find out, I don't know. But I'm going to say, don't phone Bill Sears, because he doesn't know. Well, anyway, This was one of the things that Balusi was so very valuable to us for. And he would do this, whether it was 5 minutes or 20, I don't know. But he really, both of them, both Fazi and Balusi, would stand there all day long, taking turns. And we got all the translating. And it all worked very nicely, excepting there was one time when one of the hands were caused. And I think I'd better not give you his name. It mightn't be fair to him. But he complained that he wasn't getting it all. And he complained quite a lot about that. And he said, look, you're going too fast. I'm not getting it, and I've got to make decisions based on what I hear that comes out of that man's mouth. And you've got to slow up so I can get it. And then, do you remember Mr. Samandri? Dear old Mr. Samandri? he said something, and everybody, at least all the Persians, roared laughing. And so after that meeting was over, I went over to my one friend who could speak every language. I said, what was it that Samandri said there? Oh, he just said, oh, don't worry about it. These aren't the words of God. If I get one word in 4, that's good enough for me. But this will give you an idea of the kind of thing that Balusi was doing. And he was always very sweet, very loving, and very capable. I wrote to a friend of mine who knew him well, and she wrote back telling me a few things about him. I must read bits of this letter to you. Incidentally, this letter was from a girl whose name used to be Una Townsend, the daughter of George Townsend, and the cause George Townsend. He died some years ago. But he was a wonderful person. I wish I had time to tell you about George Townsend. At any rate, Una was her father's secretary. And if it hadn't been for Una, that last book of Townsend's, Christ in Baha'u'llah, would never have been written. Because she came in and she sat at his deathbed for weeks, and he could hardly speak. She could hardly hear him. But she got it down, and the book came out just about the time of his death. But now, that is Una, and Una is living in Canada. And so I got hold of her to get some ideas about Hassan, because she knew him. Hassan was the chairman of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And so this is what she said about him. She said, he was a quiet person who liked to stay in the background, but was always brought to the foreground because of his vast knowledge and his interesting way of telling us about the faith and its history. He told us things about the letters of the living and the Baghdad period that I've never seen in print. Perhaps they are in his new book. When he spoke, you could hear a pin drop. There was always a good feeling when he entered the room, and everyone smiled. We all felt his beautiful spirit. Someone remarked, whenever I wonder what I should do about something, I always say to myself, what would Hassan do if he were in my shoes? In those days, he had little boys, 3, then 4, then 5. The only time I ever saw him ruffled was at a summer school when there was backbiting. He said that if it didn't stop, the summer school would have to be closed. He was chairman of the NSA of Great Britain for a long time. Shortly before our beloved guardian passed away, he and John Farabee were made hands to the cause. He was brought up in the faith in Bombay, where his parents were pioneering. We heard a lot about this afternoon. At 15, he decided to be a Muslim because it seemed to him unreal that his first cousin could be as described in the Roman Testament of Abba. Did you know that? Later he went to Haifa to meet his cousin, that of Shogi Effendi, and it seemed to him the greatest proof of the truth of the cause. One reason, he went there with lots of questions, but his mind went completely blank when he met Shogi Effendi. However, unasked, the guardian proceeded to answer each one of these questions. Hassan's mother was an Afna, I think a sister of the guardian's father. Hassan's father was the son of an Iranian ambassador. So that's that letter, and that tells you a little bit of Hassan, perhaps in addition to what we've had the joy of hearing this afternoon. There are so many things. When we began our first conclave on that day, when we first realized that we had to have translations, and Belusi and Fezi stepped into the breach and did it for us, that was the first day when we realized what the guardian had meant when he referred to us as the chief stewards of the embryonic world commonwealth of Baha'u'llah. And here we were, all of a sudden, with this responsibility thrust upon us, for which none of us were prepared. We had no idea what this meant. Probably Ruhi Hanum may have had an idea, because she had been his secretary and his wife for 20 years. And suddenly here we were, 26 of us, and we realized then that we had to manage the affairs of the cause in the absence of Shogi Effendi, without his advice, without his guidance, without him. And so then we worked out all the things that we simply had to do. Now, the reason I told you that about the infallibility is that I must make the point that here we were without any infallibility. We, the hands, who by now the chief stewards of the faith, we had no infallibility at all. And it was quite a thing for us to suddenly realize that this was the case. And so we talked about this, and we realized then, and do you know that at that time we had had 111 years of infallibility. During the missions of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Adwa, Shogi Effendi. Add all those up and you'll get 111 years. We had this marvelous, beautiful infallibility where we could depend on everything that came. The low center. But suddenly we were bereft. We didn't have it. And here we were, 26 of us, trying to figure out what the guardian really wanted us to do as his chief stewards. So, we then realized, to our great joy, that the Universal House of Justice, when it was brought into being, it would have infallibility again. You see, we didn't have it then, but we knew Baha'u'llah had promised that the Universal House of Justice, when it was created, when it was brought into being, it would be under the direct, infallible guidance of God. So this was a tremendous thing for us to suddenly realize that we only had 5.5 years to go. And we were then in the middle of the Guardian's 10-year spiritual crusade. You see, he died in 1957. The plan in November, the plan had been given to us in Rizwan in 1953. So we were halfway through the plan, and we realized the first thing we had to do was to complete the plans of the Guardian. We had to complete that 5-year plan. And that, as we looked at it, was an amazing thing to do. We didn't think there was a hope in the world of doing it. One thing we had was, in Latin America, we had to have 22 national spiritual assemblies. 22. And at that time, there were some countries that didn't even have one local spiritual assembly. And then we had to have 11 national spiritual assemblies in Europe. And we didn't have, some countries there didn't have even one local assembly. And it just seemed impossible. But our job was to keep in touch with all the Baha'is all over the world, get them all working, inspire them, as the Guardian had done all those years before, to rise and to go out and teach the faith. And this wasn't easy. And we didn't know at that time whether the Baha'is of the world would support us in this or not. They weren't accustomed to not having a Guardian. And so we made many decisions. One was we had to complete the Guardian's plan. The other thing, and I think perhaps one of the wisest things we did, was we decided that first conclave that we must follow the thinking of Shoghi Effendi. In every decision that came up, we would say, well, what would Shoghi Effendi do in this case? And we had many very difficult cases. We appointed our 9 members of the Hands of the Holy Land, 9 hands to stay there, and assigned all the other hands to various continents around the world. And we started in then to inform the friends and to try to figure out how we could guarantee all these plans to be completed. And there were a lot of other plans, not just those national assemblies that had to be brought into being. But so all this is what we had to do, and this was the institution of the chief stewards of the embryonic world, Commonwealth of Baha'u'llah. And this is where our friend Hassan Balusi played such an extraordinarily important part. And it is really to tell you about him doing that I have started to tell you the story. But there are many other angles to it. I don't know of which. I have a whole list of things to tell you that you might like. One was, there was one hand who was a darling, who was just a beautiful, lovely, wonderful person, and that was Millie Collins. Millie died about the age of 93, before, just about the time the house was brought into being. Incidentally, we got through to 1963. That was the year when we found we could bring in the house, and we consulted with Shoghi Effendi's lawyer, and we found that everything was in absolutely wonderful shape. Sometimes people say to me, Shoghi Effendi really was wonderful, wasn't he? But he did die without a will. They kind of hold that against him. Well, the thing is that That's all he could do. Had he left a will, we'd have paid millions of dollars in taxes. But you see, he didn't own a penny. He had millions of dollars of property and money in his name, but it didn't belong to him. He didn't have any money. Now his wife, she was a Maxwell, and there was lots of money in that family. So she didn't need any money, and they had no children. So he didn't need to leave any money to his wife, and he didn't need to leave any money to anybody. And so that was made clear, and we just have to pay taxes, because there was no tax. He didn't leave any money, and you pay taxes on money you leave, and so all this sort of thing. And people were expecting there would be a second guardian. I remember when I went to the funeral from Rhodesia, Audrey took me to the train and she said, "Give my love to the second guardian and tell him that I love him and I'll serve him forever." And that's the way I felt, the way a lot of us felt. And we expected there would be a second guardian. And in those days, before the guardian died, for years, we, the Baha'is, would sit down together and talk about this, that, and the other thing. And one question that would come up so often is, who do you suppose will be the second guardian? We knew there must be one. Must be a second guardian. How could we get along without one? And then suddenly we realized that when he died and there was no will, which there couldn't have been, and there was no second guardian, there were no children. And instead of the second guardian, he appointed the hands, the chief stewards of the embryonic Royal Commonwealth of Baha'u'llah. And we carried on until the House of Justice came into being in 1963. You see, and that is how the guardian managed the whole thing. And he had a very capable, very able lawyer in Haifa, who had been his lawyer for some 20 years. We consulted him, and he told us all, he gave us a whole picture, and we could see how wise Shoghi Effendi had been in everything he did. And he was beautifully wise. And so, now friends, I'm getting to the end of my time. And there's so many things I would like to tell you. Yes, I'll tell you about Millie Collins. She was the first hand. Oh, he said there's just 15 minutes left. That is about 15. Millie Collins. She was the first hand, appointed with a guardian. He appointed her in 1947. But he told her, he said, "This is just for you, Millie, don't tell anybody." And so she didn't. And it wasn't known until 4 years later. But Millie just loved Shoghi Effendi. And she was very well off. Her husband was a mining engineer, and he left her lots of money. And she went and lived there and wanted to give all her money to the thing, and gave quite a lot. But the guardian said, "Millie, you must be a good stewardess that night." At any rate, when he died, and we had our first conclave, Millie was the one of all the hands who didn't seem really to be sad. The rest of us were just broken-hearted to have no guardian. He died, he's gone. But Millie was, and she was the one who we thought would just be broken-hearted. And I remember I said to her one day, I said, "Millie, I hope you don't mind saying it, but, you're the only one of us who really isn't sad. How do you account for that? Do you mind? Sorry to ask you this, but why aren't you sad?" Well, she said, "I couldn't be." She said, every year, the guardian at Rehiahanam used to go to the mountains in the summer, and in July, and they would come and they'd say goodbye to us all. And when he'd come to me, he would say, "Now, Millie, you will look after my cables and see that I get my mail," and so on and so on. But this last time, she died in London. He didn't come back from that trip. So last time, he came to me and he just looked at me and he said, Millie, don't be sad. And that's all. And now, but he knew he wasn't coming back. And so Millie said, I couldn't be sad. If I'd been sad, I'd be disobedient to the other guardian. And he told me I mustn't be sad, so I wasn't sad. I'm not sad, I'm happy. Why shouldn't I be happy? There's Shoghi Effendi, he's up now with Adam Hall, all his old friends, family, all that. Afnan, who've gone on to be ahead of us. And we're glad that we still have some Afnans left here. Beloved friends, Allah.